Presenting Steven Van Alstine, Vice President, Education at the Canadian Payroll Association. One of Canada's top professional associations, the CPA provides Canada's only payroll certification, professional development, and government advocacy program to practitioners and their employers. Let's give it up for Steven Van Alstine, who will be throwing a spotlight on payroll in Canada.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Payroll Beyond Borders. It's a pleasure to be here with you to talk about the spotlight on Canada with respect to Canadian payroll. My name is Steven Van Alstine. I'm the Vice President of the Canadian Payroll Association, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you. I want to set the agenda highlights, but before I do that, if there are any questions that you might have through the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A chat, and I'll be responding to the chat within the platform. So what I'm going to do in terms of framing the presentation is to talk a little bit about Canada, set the stage on Canada, the similarities and the differences within Canada from a payroll perspective, looking at the complexities in Western payroll in Canada compared to the rest of the world, and then highlighting the various aspects and elements of payroll that makes Canada unique from its pure geographies. And we've had the benefit of having done two major research reports within the last few months. And I'm going to share some of the results of those reports because they're very reflective of what's happened with the pandemic, which of course all countries are facing and dealing with. But specifically, that's having an impact on payroll. It's having an impact on policy. And I think it's just a good way to frame some comparators because we did look at some comparator countries as we were doing this research. And I just really think it's a good way to frame sort of the Canadian context with regard to some of these other countries. So that's sort of what I'd like to do. But for those of you that aren't as familiar with Canada, we'll start with a map of Canada and what makes up Canada. So Canada is an amalgamation of territories and provinces. So from the British Columbia on the west coast to Newfoundland and Labrador on the east coast, we've got 10 provinces and 3 territories. We do have a federal government as well. And this is what makes the Canada experience with regard to payroll a little more efficient because the Canada Revenue Agency, so if we start talking a little bit about the Canadian payroll taxes and statutory deductions, the Canada Revenue Agency is what we call the gatekeeper for statutory withholding within the country. So the majority of provinces actually use the agency to collect all of their most of their specific taxation related, personal income tax related deductions. So Canada has our Canada Pension Plan, we've got employment insurance, and we've got income tax on the federal and provincial levels, except in the province of Quebec, which has its own agency. And so Quebec is sort of our standalone or our standout from that perspective. So that's what makes Canada unique with regard to how payroll is administered. If we want to draw some comparisons, many countries have a government-funded pension plan system that is a basis of deductions from employers and employees. Also, some types of employment, we call it employment insurance. Some countries call it unemployment insurance. So if we just draw the comparison to the United States as an example, they have FICA, the Federal Insurance Act, and they've got FUTA, the Federal Unemployment Insurance Act. So those are the comparators to the CPP and the employment insurance side of things. Revenue Quebec obviously has the same pension system. They have their own unique parental insurance plan, which is sort of the equivalent of unemployment insurance. And this is in instances where individuals go on maternity and parental leave. And then they administer their own provincial income tax. So just to give you a flavor for what the CPP amounts are, this would be on an employee basis and an employer basis. So whatever the deductions for the employee, the employer matches. So it's around $3,200 federally, and in the province of Quebec, it's around $3,400. So you can see the differences in the contribution rates there. This was for 2021. Employment insurance is around $900 for the employee. The employer pays a bit of a premium with regard to what is deducted for employees, so about $1,200, just over $1,200. So again, that gives you some perspectives on the deductions that are taken on an annual basis for employees that hit those maximums, maximum earning levels. QPIP on the Quebec side is an additional $400, just over $400, and $577 for the employer side. We also, for unemployment or through employment insurance, if individuals have interruptions in their earnings, Canada is somewhat unique in that we have to provide the government with a record of employment. So that basically details the earnings, the insurable earnings individuals have earned, that helps the government determine what somebody would receive in the event that they would leave their employment for issues of layoffs, shortages of work, to return to school. And then the government determines whether or not they're entitled to those benefits or not. But the employer is key to provide that information to government. And that's part of what's driving some of the policy direction that we're taking in Canada because of the use of this record of employment. You know, we've moved it along to a more electronic means of exchanging that information, but we're working with government to try to make sure we can advance that even further through initiatives like real-time data, which is the case in the United Kingdom, where they're regularly sending payroll information to government. And really, I think that was a game changer for some of these governments that are currently doing that, when some of the programs were established, because with the government having that information on an ongoing basis, it enabled them to better administer some of those benefits that were provided to employees when the pandemic hit. Because we didn't have that in Canada, we only provide that information at year end. It was more challenging for us to get that information to government. So as a result, people were paid benefits that they might not otherwise have been entitled to. So again, that helps us to look forward, work with government, try to make positive changes legislatively. So the statutory deductions, the order of priority is those statutory withholdings, any legal related withholdings for garnishments or third-party demands, family support, any union deductions, those company compulsory deductions that relate to things like registered pension plan contributions, and anything voluntary, like charitable donations, just as an example. There are some obligations with regard to those provinces that I outlined, and those are listed here. So they are mostly relate to health and education. So British Columbia and Ontario have an employer health tax. Again, these are based on employee earnings, but it's an employer obligation. Manitoba, Newfoundland, and Labrador also include funding for post-secondary education through these. And then Quebec, again, uniquely Quebec, has not just a health fund, but they also have a Commission du Nombre de Travail fund, which is their employment standards, funding of the employment standards, and workforce skills development and recognition, which allows for training, funding for training. We have workers' compensation as well. And again, those are provincially based and assessed based on maximum assessable earnings. And you can see those vary across the country. One of the biggest challenges within Canada is the variability. The interprovincial variability in legislation and things like maximum assessable earnings. So that makes the administration of payroll challenging, particularly for those organizations that operate in more than one province. And there are many organizations that do that. So we'll talk about that as we talk about the research projects that we did. So annual reporting is done federally and in Quebec. And the deadlines for both of these are the end of February of the following the taxation year. So again, the United States is the end of January. Australia has a different year-end reporting time frame. So again, these just kind of highlight some of the differences with some of our peer geographies. So employment and labor standards is the other thing. And again, the variability can be particularly challenging because of the fact that British Columbia might have different overtime rules than other provinces do, for example. There's also the fact that some organizations fall under the Canada Labour Code, some fall under provincial employment and labor standards. So those add some uniquenesses to how we administer those pieces of legislation. You either are under the Canada Labour Code, and there's a list of the companies that fall under the Canada Labour Code, or you fall under provincial legislation. You don't navigate between the two. So you just have to know which one you fall under to adhere to. And components of labor standards, of course, include things like hours of work, like overtime, holidays, legislative leaves like maternity or sick leave, vacation pay and time, how you administer terminations, pay frequency, and pay statements. And of course, because of the fact that there are those 13 jurisdictions, there's 13 separate pieces of legislation. Legislation does change regularly, not just provincially. Of course, the Income Tax Act changes, the CPP rates change, the EI rates change. You have to be on top of those changes, and using the Canadian Payroll Association to keep you up to date, or sister associations like the American Payroll Association, the CIPP, TAPS, they're good avenues to be able to keep you up to date, because probably more so than any other part of the organization, legislation changes very regularly for payroll. And there's some resources on this site. On our site, we've got some government links that are really beneficial in terms of keeping up to date. So I want to finish the spotlight by talking a little bit about two research reports that the Canadian Payroll Association has undertaken recently. The first one being a COVID-19 global analysis. And again, we're going to make these research reports available to you if you're interested in digging a little deeper, because they're very robust research pieces. And I can't do them justice in talking about them here, but I'll certainly highlight what we did. So the study with COVID-19 really explored the pandemic response of 4 countries. Those were the ones that we have relationships with our sister associations. So us in Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. And we looked at mitigation programs once the pandemic did hit, including unemployment benefits, wage subsidies, and support for workers. So wage subsidies were things that often were administered through payroll or needed information from payroll. The support for workers was the worker going directly to government to get those subsidies. So the impact of payroll was less, but again, this is where government would have benefited from having access to payroll information more real time, which again, some governments do, like the United Kingdom, for example. So we looked at these 4 countries on the basis of the overall COVID-19 response, the economic impact, major programs that they undertook, and the effect on the payroll profession. And in Canada, there were close to 555 legislative and regulatory changes made either of a permanent or temporary nature related to the pandemic that had a direct impact on payroll. And what that did is it had an impact on the volumes and the effort put forward to execute them within payroll. So it was a huge impact to payroll. Payroll was really deemed to be essential during this period. An example of that is that record of employment form that I talked about, where in a 2-month period, 6 million ROEs had to be produced, where the usual volume was 1.4 times. So almost a 6 times multiplier. And the measures with a direct impact on payroll made up a considerable percentage of the relief efforts. And that was in Canada, 40%. So again, lots of complexities faced by professionals within the payroll industry. So the outputs of that report really were threefold. The interregional harmonization and how that contributes to a better approval rating of the response. And Australia had a 6% higher approval rating than Canada in terms of the response, the COVID response. And again, we feel that the challenges were that variability in interregional, the differences between provinces. And Australia doesn't have as much interregional, or they have more interregional harmonization, and that made the response more effective. Including payroll professionals in initial consultations on government initiatives, we feel is very important. We've highlighted that with government, requiring that payroll data can, again, assist in creating more effective and efficient programs and program administration. And then the digital payroll systems to improve the rollout of income-tested government assistance programs. Like we recognize that we're right now working on an initiative called e-payroll, where we'll do that real-time payroll data exchange. But if we'd had that prior to the pandemic, it would have made the administration of those programs much more efficient. And I'm going to wrap up by talking about the remote and cross-border employment trends research report that we undertook. And it looked at remote work across Canadian, provincial, and international borders, because it's becoming more increasingly common. especially with the pandemic. And such trends have a major impact on how employers conduct payroll. So we commissioned a study with PricewaterhouseCoopers to determine the impacts on remote and cross-border work on Canadian employers, with a focus on those implications for payroll, because of the fact that those stay-at-home orders had forced many employers to work from home. But that enabled employers and employees to reimagine the future of work. So this results in Canada and other countries experiencing a growing shortage of in-demand skills, and it created a more complex challenge for payroll. So we interviewed several large employers to get perspectives on the intentions being taken and considered for remote work and hiring moving forward. And many issues were identified, including the adherence of provincial standards where employees, might have been headquartered from one jurisdiction but worked in another. And governments were being flexible in the application of pieces of legislation in that regard. But as things the dust kind of starts to settle and we see the future of work, we said we need to work closely with government to look at the legislation and regulation and how payroll is administered as a result of that. So some skills we've identified have become increasingly more global. So there's been an increase in international cross-border hiring, particularly in those jurisdictions that are adjacent to each other, like the United States and Canada, where there's lots of cross-border exchange. So we looked at 6 jurisdictions and we selected those to compare in terms of the relative ease or lack thereof for a foreign employer to comply with payroll withholding, remitting, and reporting obligations of a resident employee working for a former employer. And this is the interesting slide that I think many of you will find interesting. We looked at Canada, Australia, the United States, the United Kingdom, the 4 countries we looked at in our previous report, but we also looked at Brazil in South America, and we looked at India because those, again, we were finding where there was more interchange with resource and skill. And, in the typical fashion of green meaning go, yellow meaning slow down, and red meaning stop, you can see that there's limited compliance challenges, mostly in Brazil. The next country would probably be Australia, US, and UK. There's a bit of a mix there. Some less restriction in India. But moderate compliance challenges are resident in a lot of places, like the United Kingdom. The big reds come up where there's significant compliance challenge with Canada. So again, this is information we can take away and work with government to try to ease those restrictions, because the fact is that, payroll is becoming more global. We're becoming more global as a world, and payroll as a result is becoming more global. So it's important to look at these impediments. So the interesting things we looked at here is local establishment required? Well, in India, it's not in any other jurisdiction. You have to look at the terms like TD1, which is the tax exemption results, and the T2200, which is where you have expenses, and that form and the administration of that form is particularly complex in Canada. So again, it gives us the opportunity to talk to government about changing those things. So I hope you've gotten some perspectives on sort of what the pandemic has meant, how that relates to some of our peer global payroll relationships. And I think we're going to pause there just simply because we've got a lot of, we have a short amount of time, a lot of information to get through. I want to thank you for participating. My information is on the screen. Please feel free to send me an email. And I hope you look at those reports in a little more detail, because I think they're very insightful. So thank you for your time. I hope you've enjoyed the spotlight on Canada, and enjoy the rest of Payroll Beyond Borders. Thank you.